Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I see the room, our virtual room filling up as everybody enters. We'll give just a few seconds to let folks file in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Got a great number of people joining us today, so we're so happy to have all of you here from all over the world. All right, as people are filing in, we can go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's lecture, The Road to Tutankhamun, Records of Exploration and Excavation in 19th and early 20th century Personal Archives with Dr. Sarah Ketchley. And I'm Lisa Radici, RC's US Director. We're so pleased to have you with us today. So today's lecture is really a special edition as we kick off our celebration of all things to King Tutankhamun, starting in 2022, right around the corner, the 100th anniversary of Howard Carter's discovery. So in celebration of this momentous occasion, RC is launching a suite of events, publications, and projects to commemorate this important discovery. And I'm going to share some more information about what we have in store at the close of the lecture, so stay tuned to hear more. So now I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Sarah Ketchley. Dr. Ketchley is an Egyptologist with a specialty in art history in the first millennium BCE. Based at the University of Washington in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Dr. Ketchley teaches introductory and graduate level classes in digital humanities and directs a long-running undergraduate internship program. Inspired by intrepid women travelers of the 19th century, Dr. Ketchley works with students to digitize and publish a range of primary source material from the period, including the Nile travel diaries of Mrs. Emma B. Andrews. Working computationally to analyze the content of Emma's writings, Sarah and her students have created an extensive digital biographical database, interactive maps, and an archive of encoded primary source material from the golden age of Egyptian archaeology. Today, Dr. Ketchley will be presenting The Road to Tutankhamun, Records of Exploration and Excavation, as I mentioned earlier. And just to give a tiny introduction to the presentation, in 1912, American lawyer-turned-archaeologist Theodore M. Davis famously said that I fear the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted. But the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, of course, proved him quite wrong. Davis had an impressive record of excavation, working with Egyptologists and archaeologists, including Howard Carter, in the years before Carter's partnership with Lord Carnarvon. So today, in Dr. Ketchley's talk, we'll discuss excavation in the Valley of the Kings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, using personal archives such as diaries and letters to build that picture of archaeological life in Egypt. So thank you all for being here, and please welcome Dr. Sarah Ketchley.
Thank you so much, Liska, for the introduction, and good afternoon or good evening to you all, wherever you may be. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak today about my work, which, as Liska mentioned, primarily focuses on 19th century Nile travelogues, memoirs, and personal archives through the lens of the field of digital humanities. I'm based at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I want to acknowledge that my project is both a research project as well as being a pedagogical project. And as such, it's a collaborative team effort, which includes a fantastic group of undergraduate and graduate student interns, some of whose transcription and analysis work you'll be seeing today. So my talk is going to focus on excavation in the Valley of the Kings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the years before the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter in late 1922. I'll be approaching this topic by talking about the content of a set of diaries that have been the bedrock of my research for nearly 10 years, the diaries of Mrs. Emma B. Andrews. So I'll begin today by introducing you to Mrs. Andrews and giving you a brief overview of her written record and why it's valuable in terms of developing insights into 19th century social and archaeological networks. Any mention of Emma Andrews almost inevitably brings to mind Theodore Davis, who was arguably the most famous American involved in what has been called the golden age of Egyptian archaeology in the early 20th century. He was not an archaeologist or a scholar and had almost no formal education, but like Lord Carnarvon, he paid for excavations in the Valley of the Kings between 1902 and 1914, which were more productive than any other individual's efforts there. And his explorations unearthed a record 18 tombs and made him an international celebrity. He was renowned for finding a new tomb every year and vastly increased the public's interest in ancient Egypt. Today, we'll take a look at a few of those excavations as recorded both by Emma and by some of her contemporaries, including Howard Carter, Joseph Lindon Smith, Mary Buttles Newbury, and Helen Winlock. These people have a few things in common. First of all, they had a relationship with Emma Andrews or with Theodore Davis and were therefore mentioned in Emma's diaries. And then secondly, this reference in the diaries prompted our team to embark on biographical research, which in these cases led me to track down additional letters and diaries to add to our project archive. These primary sources also give us some different views of excavation and insights into the practicalities of Nile travel, including renting a dahabeah, staying in hotels, or life in an archaeological dig house. Then there are a few nuggets of excavation gossip, which help to bring history alive. And so I've chosen a few snippets to share today, which I hope you'll enjoy. I finish by talking a little bit about our project working processes with the primary source material, and I'll show you some of the ways that we're using the transcribed text to build historical and biographical databases, as well as an online immersive reader and interactive visualizations of social networks in Egypt at the turn of the century. So Emma Buttles Andrews was born in 1837, and she was the youngest daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Ohio at that time. She married an equally well-to-do lawyer in 1859, Abner Andrews, who was the son of the state bank, the president of the State Bank of Ohio. But around 1870, Abner became an invalid who was confined to his bed or to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Emma cared for him for nearly 2 decades before leaving the marriage by mutual consent. The turning point of Emma's life came when she met Theodore Montgomery Davis in 1860, when he stopped to visit the Buttles family with his new bride, Annie, who happened to be a cousin of Emma's. After that initial meeting, Theodore stopped in Columbus on subsequent years until Emma finally moved in with him permanently when she was 50 in 1887. Davis's background was in law, but he practiced initially in Iowa before moving to New York after the Civil War. One of his friends and business partners at the time was the corrupt politician Boss Tweed, and they began making a lot of money together. Davis combined a keen intellect, a capacity for hard work, and a bit of luck with repeated perjuries, bribes, and frauds to make his fortune. He was the subject of 3 intensive investigations by the US Congress and managed to avoid being indicted each time. By 1882, at the age of 44, Davis retired from his New York law practice and built a 30-room, 25,000 square foot Queen Anne-style home on Ocean Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, reportedly with Emma's design suggestions. This mansion came to be called the Reef, and it's pictured here. And in 1887, Emma became a permanent occupant along with Theodore, and sometimes with Theodore's wife, Annie, although more often than not, Annie traveled and lived with her sister. From spring till fall, despite Emma's status as Theodore's mistress, the house was alive with visiting friends and relatives. Emma's first entries in her diary, which ultimately came to be called a Journal on the Bedouin, begin at this time in 1889, and they continue through 1913. The diaries themselves consist of 19 volumes of text, which would originally have been handwritten. During a visit to New York in 1916, after Theodore's death, the then director of the Egyptian department at the Met, Albert Lithgow, persuaded Emma to allow them to make 4 typewritten copies of the originals. 3 of these manuscripts remain. There are 2 bound copies still in the Met, and the other one is in the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And we've been working from the latter copy, which was originally owned by Herbert Winlock. It's not known what became of the original handwritten journals, unfortunately. On the screen is a reproduction of a couple of pages of the APS version. And as you can see, the writing is largely readable, although at times some words can be blurry or indistinct. Emma included some sketches of floor plans and hieroglyphs in her record, which the typist copied and included in the typescript, as you can see here. The process of researching Emma's life and the content of her diaries led me to visit archives in the US and the UK to dig out as much information about her as I could find. And this almost inevitably brought new research leads and avenues for exploration to light. I've been steadily adding to the project's digital archives, either by taking photographs of related historical material during my visits, or by mining the web for contemporary publications like books and newspapers. This is a snapshot of a few of the texts we've been working with, which range from printed books to letters to manuscripts and handwritten diaries. I'll be including observations from 3 of these travelers who kept personal archives today. So we've transcribed a large collection of letters written between 1898 and 1909 by Joseph Lindon Smith during his early trips to Egypt to paint the monuments along the Nile, including the temples at Abu Simbel and at Luxor. He became renowned for his realistic and accurate work, which attracted buyers and patrons like Phoebe Hearst and Isabella Stewart Gardner. He worked for Theodore Davis during the 1904 to 1906 period, and he kept diaries about these 2 seasons of excavation and painting. He was accompanied on his travels by his wife Corinna and his 2 young daughters, as well as his mother and father. Lindon Smith was present when Davis opened a number of remarkable tombs, and his commentary is detailed and offers some amusing insights into some of the characters working on site at the time. He went on to publish his memoir, Temples, Tombs, and Ancient Art, in 1956, which also describes some of the experience he had working on Davis's excavations. Mary Buttles Newbury was a cousin of Emma's who originally visited the reef in Newport and who was invited to join the Davis party during their penultimate trip along the Nile in 1912 to 1913. Her youngest daughter also accompanied them, Doris. Emma's diaries at this point are quite sparse for a number of reasons, not least because Theodore's health was declining during these last visits. Mary's record, by contrast, is chatty and descriptive and also pretty witty. Her family compiled her letters into a document called A Winter on the Nile, and I'll be showing a few excerpts from her writing today. And then we have Helen Winlock, who was the wife of Herbert Winlock, director of the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian expedition in Luxor and elsewhere. The diaries we've transcribed date from late 1912 through 1914, when Helen was a newlywed, finding herself thrown into life as an archaeologist's wife in Egypt, writing home to her parents and her brother and sister. The letters give interesting insights into day-to-day life in Luxor, and they dovetail with Emma and Mary Buttles Newbury's accounts from this period. The topics she writes about cover furnishing the newly completed Metropolitan Dig House and entertaining the many visitors who pass through Luxor, as well as supporting her husband's work, notably around the Temple of Mentuhotep on the West Bank. The path to Egypt inevitably involved a transatlantic crossing, and the Davis party would set sail from New York in November of each year on a variety of steamers, which included the most luxurious transatlantic vessels of the day, some of which are pictured here. The group was held in high esteem, and Emma was quite frequently given the captain's quarters on the ship. They stayed in Egypt till approximately March or April of each year, returning via Italy, where they would spend several weeks on the trail of artwork to purchase. Finally, they'd spend time in Paris and London before sailing back to New York from either Southampton or Liverpool, arriving in Newport ready to begin the social whirl of the summer season. The party usually included various friends and relatives, and they traveled in considerable style, with 20 or 30 pieces of luggage apiece, containing books, clothing, and a broad selection of medicinal concoctions, which included Emma's selection of homeopathic remedies for the many coughs and colds that plagued her throughout her travels. During their first and subsequent visits to Cairo, the party stayed at the famous Shepherd's Hotel to plan their trips along the Nile. While they were there, they stayed in the same luxurious apartments year after year. This renowned establishment had a very long history, and its terraces famously served tea to the many wealthy expatriates and tourists visiting Egypt. This view of the decadent foyer in the top left is a T.H. McAllister magic lantern slide taken in 1900. During these first three trips, the Davis party focused on tourism and the purchase of trinkets and antiquities. They rented a dahabeah during each of these early visits before having their own vessel constructed called the dahabeah Bedouin, which was finished in 1896. On screen is an image of the dahabeah Nubia, which they rented in 1890. This photo was taken by the famous Italian photographer Antonio Beato, who had a studio on the east bank of the Nile in Luxor at the time. Emma describes his visit in her diary, complaining that everyone was excessively stupid as they tried to organize themselves on deck. Emma goes into some detail about the crew on the dahabeah Nubia, and we're able to identify the captain standing on the prow of the boat here. Emma says that she thinks his red leather shoes, which he was most proud of, are worn more as a status symbol than for comfort, since he takes them off at every opportunity he gets and sets them formally beside him. The dragoman Mohammed Salah is standing on the steps to the upper deck. His role was to manage all the logistics of the Nile trip, including boat rental, the party's forays on shore, staff hiring, and management. He joined Emma and Theodore as their dragoman 3 times, and it's obvious that the Americans held him in very high esteem. They refer to him as dear old Salah. And in return, he took the party to visit his family in a village close to Abu Simbel on a couple of occasions, and continued to keep in touch with them each subsequent season through the years that they traveled. The American party is pictured on deck here. There are 2 women and 2 men. Interestingly, this is the only photo of Emma Andrews that I've been able to find so far, and which of the 2 women she actually is unclear. The second female is her niece, Jeanette, or Nettie Buttles, who later wrote the book, The Queens of Egypt. Theodore Davis is one of the men, and a Mr. Fielding, who was traveling with them, is the second man. The Lindon Smith diaries also that contained contributions by Joseph, by Corinna, and their parents. And they give us a record of the family's rental of the dahabeah Abu Simbel in the winter of 1904 through 1905, when they sailed from Aswan to Luxor, before mooring on the west bank of the Nile for the season. And then they rented the dahabeah Bijou for their return trip. The family the next season rented the dahabeah Stella in the 1906 to 1907 season. And like Emma, Joseph and Corinna compile a list of the crew on each boat, which you can see on the slide here. And many of the sailors make repeated appearances through each of their 2 diaries. including in this image of their two daughters, Totty and Tiny, or Rebecca and Frances, from 1905. The couple kept a careful account of their money, and you can see that the diary was also used as a place for totting up wages and the cost of their dahabeah rental. Corinna estimated that they were living on $2 a day, which, as she notes, is much cheaper than Boston. There was quite a dahabeah rental trade on the Nile. Joe records how they rented the bijou for 2 months, straight after a couple called the Fergusons. The rental agreement with the Cairo-based owner was negotiated by telegram, and then a separate contract was made with the Rais and his sailors who were in Luxor already. Nile travel and living obviously wasn't all glamour and tea parties, and Emma complains regularly about her chest infections, the insects, and the cold. Things weren't much better on land, apparently. Helen and Herbert Winlock were among the first to stay at Metropolitan Museum's Dig House in February 1913. In fact, Herbert had been involved in the design of the building, which is still used today. Helen's letters contain a lot of detail about the challenges of finding and transporting furnishings, employing and managing their staff, and keeping the fauna at bay. In this excerpt, she is describing the range of insects that they deal with on a daily basis, including the 17 fleas that she found on her body, bed bugs, spiders, and so on. And she notes that the ants ate through the ceiling in Howard Carter's house before moving on to the straw in the mud bricks. Emma records some of Davis's first acquisitions of Egyptian antiquities, such as these mummy masks, which were purchased in February 1890 from a well-known antiquities dealer in Luxor named Mohammed Muhassib, who subsequently became a respected friend of the couple. These two mummy masks are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they were originally from the 18th dynasty tomb of Amenhotep, overseer of the builders of Amun. Portions of Amenhotep's Book of the Dead were also purchased by Davis at the same time, and these are in the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. After 5 years of Nile travel, Emma and Theodore were familiar faces among the wealthy tourists and Egyptologists working in Egypt at the time. It's often been written that Theodore Davis's interest in collecting antiquities drove him to seek the concession to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. But I believe that, in fact, Emma was actually the catalyst which prompted the transition from tourism to archaeology. As you can see from this diary entry from 1899, Emma was keen to mingle with the Egyptologists that they met during their travels from an early date. Theodore, by contrast, was less interested. Emma was particularly taken with Percy Newberry, a British Egyptologist who is pictured here. While Newberry was undoubtedly looking for financial support, he was also astute enough to recognize Emma's intellect and genuine interest in history and archaeology. Newberry also introduced Emma and Theodore to Howard Carter in 1899. At that time, Carter was between jobs and making a living selling his paintings to tourists. Emma records that they had afternoon tea and then dinner with Carter, and that she purchased 2 sketches from him, one of which would have been a copy of his 1896 picture here of Queen Ahmes. 2 years later, Carter became Antiquities Service Inspector for Upper Egypt, and at his instigation, Davis was granted the coveted concession to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. One of the conditions of the contract was that he would employ trained archaeologists who oversee the excavations, and his reward as sponsor of this work was a share of the many finds that he made, generously gifted to him by the Egyptian government. Theodore's first solo excavation was early in 1902 with Howard Carter as his frontman. Davis discovered one tomb this year, that of the nobleman Usahet, numbered KV 45. This photograph was found between the pages of Emma's niece Nettie Buttles' diary, which is currently in the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and it was taken probably by Howard Carter. Nettie is pictured here holding the mask that they discovered, but shortly after it was taken, unfortunately, the mask fell apart. The tomb was reopened in 1990 by my friend Don Ryan and his team from Pacific Lutheran University, who discovered one of the mask's eyebrows. He also discovered a selection of shabtis mentioned by Carter and pieces of a 20th dynasty coffin reconstructed by the team. Carter next found and began clearing the cliff tomb of Hatshepsut, but work was put on hold there for his next thrilling discovery, as Emma puts it, the tomb of Thutmosis IV. Emma describes her experiences as one of the first visitors into the tomb, scrambling down a 20-foot drop holding onto a rope, and then sitting down to shuffle along a low-roofed corridor. She says that Gaston Maspero was so stout that he had to lay down with his feet sometimes on Howard Carter's shoulders in order to negotiate the corridor. She describes the layout and decoration of the tomb and comments on the beautiful debris which was strewn over the floor of the hall and the chapels, most of which was broken. Carter had placed boards on the ground so that the party could walk safely without causing destruction. Some of the artifacts which Davis and Carter discovered in Thutmosis's tomb include this sycamore panel from a chair depicting the pharaoh as a sphinx, subduing the enemies of Egypt. It's now in the Metropolitan Museum as part of the Davis bequest. After completing the clearance of the tomb of Thutmosis IV, Carter resumed work on KV-20, Hatshepsut's tomb. It was the original burial place of Thutmosis I, Hatshepsut's father, before he was reinterred in KV-38. Later, the tomb was adapted by Hatshepsut to accommodate both her and her father. Emma's eyewitness accounts of many of Davis's excavations are significant not just for the historical insight that they offer, but because she provides observations about the conditions of excavation of the day, which are telling and often quite graphic. In the case of this tomb, the rock was very hard and corridors were blocked by debris. Emma describes Howard Carter's state during these challenging, slow, and expensive excavations, saying that he was a horrid object and really quite sick when he eventually emerged from the tomb. She included a sketch of the burial chamber, as was then, and notes the position of the sarcophagi and a fine canopic box of crystalline red sandstone, which was beautifully polished and inscribed. In February 1905, Davis began working with Arthur Weigel, a new appointee to the Antiquities Service, as his predecessor, James Quibell, shifted to a different role. Their first success was the discovery of the small tomb of Yuya and his wife Tui, parents of Queen T and in-laws of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. The tomb had been disturbed in antiquity, but to a limited degree, and the mummies still lay within, along with much of their burial equipment. It was the best preserved tomb to be found in Egypt at that time, prior to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Joe Lindon Smith was at the scene and was one of the first to go down with Arthur Weigel as far as the lower door, where he peered into a room that was absolutely full, overflowing of rich, rare treasures, packed full. It was all like dreams, as he put it. Corinna Lindon Smith was also invited to scramble over the walled-up doorway, which had been partially broken down by thieves in antiquity. Maspero asked Joe to make a color study of the tomb, which he did by electric light. And the couple wrote in their diary that it has been a day never, never to be forgotten. At the time, the discovery made the front pages around the world, and Davis was feted as a New York archaeologist who discovered a scientific sensation. These headlines from the New York Times on the left and the Illustrated London News on the right are both typical, and perhaps foreshadow the reporting by the Times of London when Tutankhamun's tomb was found 17 years later. One of the contributions Davis made to archaeology was his commitment to exploring every inch of the Valley of the Kings to thoroughly determine what was there. Previous diggers in the valley had used their hunches and instincts to identify likely spots for tombs, hunting, as Davis put it, hither and thither. After the discovery of the tomb of Yuya and Tui, shown in this slide from Davis's publication, in what the experts had called an extremely unlikely spot, Davis realized that only by exhaustively searching every foot of the valley hillsides down to bedrock would all the ancient tombs be found. Although the concept is not especially complicated, Davis was the first person to commit to spending the time and, importantly, the money to do it. Through 6 different archaeologists, Davis was the only common thread that ensured the entire valley was investigated. He later told a friend that all he could take credit for was a clearing job, but his example of how richly a thorough and systematic exploration of an entire site was rewarded was another contribution to archaeology that was taken to heart by later diggers. Following the discovery of Yuya and Tuyu's tomb, Davis began working with archaeologist Edward Ayrton to allow Weigel more time to focus on his job as Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt. This picture was taken around that time and shows Davis with Weigel and his wife Hortense on the left of the photo, and Ayrton on the right, looking very dapper, outside the tomb of Ramesses IV. In January 1906, Ayrton discovered a single well-cut chamber close to the tomb of Ramesses IX. Tomb KV55 and its subsequent excavation have proven to be highly controversial, not least because the mummy Davis identified as Queen T turned out to be that of a man, probably Akhenaten. The combined disarray of the finds and their fragile condition required careful documentation and slow, patient excavation. Neither of these happened. Davis's published account is lacking detail, and much of the material perished before it had been documented. Emma's account offers vital supplementary information about the condition of the tomb. She describes its opening in detail and Davis's excitement as he shouts out, "By Jove, Queen T, and no mistake," a theory that he stuck to until his death. Joe Lindon Smith records that Maspero sent him down into the tomb so that he could copy the gold leaf decoration on a wide wooden door, which would be destroyed when the group accessed what lay beyond. Maspero read Lindon Smith's transcription, which included the name and titles of Queen T, and then sent him back into the corridor to crawl along and see what he could see in the burial chamber. Even then, Lindon Smith reported his presence changed the atmosphere in the tomb and that he saw one piece of gold foil detach from the wood beneath and fall to the floor. Emma mentions the dismantled shrine with its cartouche of T and Amenhotep III and notes that the burial chamber was not large, but in a state of great confusion. Theodore was determined that Nettie should be the first one to see it, and she was the first woman to enter. Lindon Smith provides more detail about the chamber's disarray and notes that the coffin with its lid askew was inlaid with semi-precious stones. Emma eventually went down into the tomb 10 days after it had been opened and describes the disarray of the chamber, noting that the wood was disintegrating before their eyes and gold foil was literally floating in the air. After the coffin was opened and the body had crumbled to a mass of black dust and bones, Davis brought the gold vulture crown back to the Bedouin, where it was stored in the closet at the end of Emma's bed. An influx of visitors to view the find over the next month or so ended up being a nuisance and an impertinence, as Emma put it. And what they thought was a headrest is actually a pectoral, and it's pictured here. In the winter of 1906, Davis and Edward Ayrton discovered a blue cup engraved with the cartouche of Tutankhamun next to a rock in the Valley of the Kings. Then a year later, in 1907, Harold Jones and Davis dug down into a room blocked with mud and found a broken box containing pieces of gold leaf stamped with the name of Tutankhamun, I, and both their wives. They then found a small pit tomb, which you can see in the photograph here, where the man is standing in the red rectangle. The tomb was filled with large pots, which they transported back to Davis's dig house, and they found that some contained linens with Tutankhamun's name on them, along with wreaths of flowers, one of which is pictured here. These three discoveries led Davis to conclude that he had found King Tutankhamun's tomb, and he famously said that the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted. Davis considered the group of objects from the pit tomb to be something of a disappointment, and he donated them all almost immediately to the Metropolitan Museum. Herbert Winlock later wrote the book, The Funeral of Tutankhamun, which looked more closely at the collected material from these excavations, identifying their importance as items associated with Tutankhamun's embalming and funeral rites. You can also see a couple of pages of Carter's handwritten notes about this discovery in the bottom left, referencing Davis's publication as well. Prior to his death in 1915, Theodore Davis discovered and excavated 18 of the 42 royal tombs now known in the Valley of the Kings, including what was the best preserved tomb to be found in Egypt at that time. Davis sponsored a number of contemporary tomb reports which set new standards for publication of archaeological finds. He covered the costs to print 7 lavish volumes about the excavations he had paid for, and the books were all written by the archaeologists who'd done the work. Then, as now, money for publication was not easily obtained, but Davis always produced extensive and prompt books about the work that not only served the purposes of Egyptologists around the world, but also increased public interest in the field. His book on Horemheb's tomb was called, at the time of publication, the most magnificent Egyptological book published in recent years. And as recently as 2001, it was called a classic and a work of fundamental importance. Carter was one of the contributors to the publications, and his notes recording the excavations are now in the Griffith Institute in Oxford. These typewritten cards are a recording of the opening of KV 55. And while the handwritten document is a list of the spelling variants of the names in the tomb of Yuya and Tui. And as you can see, and unsurprisingly, Carter's hieroglyphic script was really quite beautiful. Not all things ran smoothly in archaeological circles, and there were plenty of clashes and intrigues at the dig houses, at the Antiquities Service and on site. You can see that Helen Winlock writes in one of her letters that the amount of gossip we have heard is astounding. The next couple of slides are a few observations about Egyptologists that I have found interesting or amusing as I've been reading through the diaries and letters. In 1903, Emma reports that the Egyptologist Wallace Budge had dinner on their dahabeah and was recounting a tale of a boat trip with William Flinders Petrie, where he found him to be as odoriferous as a polecat, which will come as no surprise to those who know about Petrie's bare bones or rustic living conditions and policies on his own excavations. Alan Gardner was another very particular gentleman who Helen Winlock tells us loves tombs and expects to end his days in one. His fussiness meant that he soon wore out his welcome in archaeological circles and caused Herbert to call him an old sheep. Helen and Herbert also met Percy Newberry in England in 1912 when they visited to take a look at the Egyptian antiquities he had collected. And Helen notes that the old codger, as she called him, was able to dangle a cigarette very cleverly from his protruding upper teeth. Howard Carter also makes many appearances throughout Emma's diaries and was known as something of an honorary character. His argumentative nature got him into some difficulties in his job on more than one occasion. Emma tactfully refers to his dominant personality in this diary entry from 1902, while 11 years later, Mary Newbury notes that he politely quarreled with all their party when he came to visit them. She has a lot more to say about Howard Carter in her letters, saying that he actually merits an entire paragraph to himself. She says that he used to dig for cousin Theodore until they quarreled, not politely, I fear. Now he digs for Lord Carnarvon. And she notes again that he disagreed with everything that was said. He squabbled with Emma Andrews about fleas and flesh lice, whatever they are. Before telling Mary Newbury which domino piece she should play against Davis. Mary doesn't play the piece he suggests, and when she loses and he questions why she didn't do what he told her to do, she tells Carter that she didn't play it because he told her to do so, at which point he laughs and becomes a little more amenable. This is one of Carter's letters home to his mother, which casts him in a more conversational and pleasant mood. As you can see, he pasted a few photographs to illustrate his news, describing his overnight trip from Cairo to Luxor by train and reminiscing over the slower days of dahabeeyah travel along the Nile, when the journey would take about 3 weeks and was entirely dependent on the wind. He says this luxury is now reserved for those who have the time and money to spend floating their way south along the Nile. He also mentions his pet donkey on the second page called San Toy, who he became extremely fond of. In the past, he had kept pet gazelles, but he says San Toy is much less well-behaved, with a voice far less elegant. He says that the donkey's talents lean towards gardening, where he reaps, but he never sows. Emma also mentions the donkey in her diary and says that Santoy used to go into Carter's house looking for him, braying with delight when he found him. She also reports, unfortunately, on the donkey's sad demise when he was bitten in the mouth by a cobra in 1903, and Carter was unable to save him. She said that Carter shot the snake with his gun, but was unable to save his pet. Helen Winlock has a few things to say about Emma and Theodore themselves and their traveling arrangements. Polite society overlooked Emma and Theodore's relationship for the most part, although the artist Mary Cassatt did call Emma that woman pirate in a letter in 1905. It seems to have been an open secret that Emma and Theodore had lived together for 20 to 30 years. And Helen says that Mrs. Davis doesn't like the situation as well as Mrs. Andrews does. She also references Mary Buttles and Mary Buttles Newbury and Doris as well, saying that they're all right, noting that Davis had different nieces on his boat each year who have to play solitaire with him on most days. Helen says that Davis apparently keeps a harem and that they are all a bit mad, though nobody seems to mind, the old man especially. The last diary volume dates to 1912 to 1913, but the party made one more visit to Egypt in 1913 to 1914. These final seasons were characterized by Theodore's declining health and his slow descent into dementia. He died in 1915. Emma continued to live at the Reef in Newport for a couple more years, then spent the last years of her life splitting her time between Washington, D.C. and her farm in Tyringham, Massachusetts. She died in January 1922, just months before the tomb of Tutankhamun was discovered, an event which would eclipse Davis's work in Egypt and consign him to the sidelines of history. Davis's finds include thousands of artifacts now displayed in museums in Egypt and the USA. This is a copy of 2 pages of his will, listing the items he intended to bequeath to the Met. I've highlighted what Davis considered to be the gem of his collection, here named the canopic jar of Queen Tea. In fact, it was probably made for Kia, the secondary wife of Akhenaten. Davis kept this piece on his desk at the Reef in Newport. And Emma herself also bequeathed a significant number of items during her lifetime and in her will, including linen, papyri, jewelry, and a range of Italian Renaissance furniture. This is a visual catalogue of some of those bequests to the Metropolitan Museum. We were able to scrape these public domain images and their associated metadata programmatically from the back end of the museum website, and we created a database from all of this information. Herbert Winlock and Howard Carter took an interest in cataloguing all of Davis's bequests, including those he made before his death. And in his will. The provisions of the will proved to be very contentious, and they were subject to litigation from the time of his death in 1915 until 1930, when the Metropolitan bequest was finally confirmed. I'll talk a little bit now about our workflow and our goals for some of the material that I have been showing you today. My student interns at the University of Washington have been working with me since 2011 and fairly intensively for the last couple of years to develop a process that we follow for transcribing, editing, and publishing our texts, which of course begins with the primary sources themselves. We use a platform called Tropy for collaborative transcription. It's an open source free platform. And this allows us to collect the metadata for each document and then to export all our text transcriptions in bulk. The next stage of the process is to make the texts machine readable by turning them into XML, or extensible markup language. When we started, we did all of this textual encoding by hand, which proved to be extremely laborious and error prone. So we've developed what we call the historical markup tool, which automates the process of capturing the structure of our documents, as well as the content that we're interested in tagging. The process, the tool outputs an XML document, which we then work collaboratively to clean up as necessary using an open source code editor and a platform called GitHub, which stores all of the different versions of our work. And this is what our marked up or encoded document looks like. We focus on capturing the structural elements of the text, like paragraphs, page breaks, diary entries, etc., as well as particular aspects of their content. You can see here that we've tagged people's names, place names, boats, hotels, archaeological sites, antiquities, and so on. And what this process enables me to do is essentially to run a computer script through all of our encoded documents and pull out an alphabetized list of all the tagged content, along with all the spelling variants, which we use as the basis for our biographical research. All of this information ends up in a very large database or spreadsheet. We currently have about 1,000 people that Emma has mentioned in her diaries, and a growing number of place names, hotels, boats, and so on. One of our goals has been to leverage our encoded diaries and our biographical research to provide an online immersive reading experience. And to this end, we've used a platform called TEI Publisher to display each volume of the Andrews Diaries online. We're now beginning the process of styling, and we're continuing to add content. As you can see, the platform unites the tagging we've done of people's names here in brown, along with our historical and biographical research, so that users can read brief biographies about the people that Emma mentions in her diaries. The long list of people's names in our biographical spreadsheet has also prompted us to think about how we can create an interactive network analysis to visualize Emma Andrews' extensive social connections, and thereby gain insights into the discourse and circles of influence in Egypt during this period, including economic, archaeological, and political. Our aim, once again, is to enable our users to dynamically engage with our primary source material according to their research goals, while for us, working computationally with a large collection of data provides an opportunity to discern connections that are otherwise not immediately apparent. So this past summer, we focused on building a database to generate our social network visualizations. And then we spent a lot of time thinking about how to capture the qualitative aspects of the data, namely designating occupational fields, which proved to be more challenging than we'd expected. One complicating factor was that many figures in the diary are so-called multi-hyphenates, or they had many roles, sometimes to a dubious degree. So Arthur Weigel, who I mentioned earlier, is described as an Egyptologist, an anthropologist, a stage designer, an author, and a journalist, who somehow found the time to also have tea with Emma along the way. After experimenting with a few variations of the occupational field designations, we decided that a maximum of 10 fields with 10 subcategories would be ideal for navigating the interactive visualization. And you can see these fields laid out here. We used economics as a determining factor for some of these decisions, where lawyer and amateur antiquities dealer would be categorized under lawyer, as that was where the figure derived most of their livelihood. This is still very much a work in progress, but we do have around 250 people categorized out of the broader listing of 1,000. And I wanted to show you a brief video of our first run of our network analysis. There is sound associated with this, and I hope that you'll be able to hear it. With that, I'll finish up my talk, and I would just like to say that we have a few plans for our internship for 2022, which include working with the Times of London reporting of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, to develop a database and an interactive timeline, so that we'll be able to read newspaper reporting as it happens. So we'll be updating our website with that information. But for now, I would like to express my gratitude to the students who have worked on the project, along with the institutions and the individuals who have generously provided photographs. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ketchley. This was absolutely fascinating. I loved getting to hear about these characters that we know so much about, but really get into their humanity and the gossip, the talk about Santoy and what has happened to him. Those, it really brings this, all of this to life in such a unique way. So thank you for being here today. Really wonderful. We're really grateful that you're here. So we do have a little bit of time for questions. So if you would like to ask a question to Dr. Ketchley, please put it in the Q&A box below on your Zoom screen, not the chat. And we will have about 10 minutes to answer questions. So we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. But as you take a few minutes to put your questions in the box, I do want to mention some of the RC Centennial Celebration events that we have on deck. So to mark this occasion in history, RC has planned a year-long celebration to commemorate the discovery, and that will include our King Tutankhamun National Chapter Speakers Tour, a special edition of Scribe magazine completely devoted to King Tut, a member tour to Egypt, a special centennial conference at the Grand Egyptian Museum, and we will be welcoming Lord George Carnarvon as our RC 2023 annual meeting keynote speaker. And that is really just the tip of the iceberg, as they say, for the things that we have in store. So we do ask that you make a contribution if this is exciting to you. We'll put the link in the chat box. We do need your help and support to bring all of these things to life. We're grateful for your membership, for your support, and we can't wait to bring all of these special activities your way. So it looks like we've got a good queue of questions coming through. And give me one moment and I'll read the question to 1 second. There's one question. Were there any interesting comments or views on Davis himself in the diaries and letters from the various ladies?
It's interesting because you would, given that some of these are private records, you would expect them to perhaps write frankly. But sadly, no, I can't really share any tremendous insights about Theodore Davis, aside from the fact that he was a difficult character. He knew what he wanted, and he made no bones about achieving it, but no true gossip to share, I'm afraid.
So another question, what led you to looking into these journals and recreating the links between the folks in Luxor at this time?
Yeah, I visited the Metropolitan Museum about 10 years ago and started reading Emma's diaries at that point. And I became fascinated with them. My family would probably say I was obsessed with them. But as I read them, I realized that very little was actually known about Emma herself. At the time, I was able to have a lot of conversations with John Adams, who wrote the book, The Millionaire and the Mummies, the biography of Theodore Davis. And he was very helpful as I began researching Emma's life. And as she mentioned certain people repeatedly, I came to notice that they also had personal archives. And it became apparent that my research was going in the direction of some of these hidden figures of Egyptology. So perhaps not the big names, but the often women who don't have a voice as such in the history of Egyptology. And we're hoping to change that.
Thank you. There's a question, if you're familiar, is there any overlap between this project and the Abydos archive project?
Not that I know of, no. But I will make a note to take a look at the Abydos archive just to see what resources they're looking to see if there is any overlap there. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a question, a comment and a question from one of our guests, Mary Ellen. Hello, Mary Ellen. She has enjoyed reading the novel The Visitors by Sally Bowman. Have you read it? And do you think that it's true to this period? And do you have any other recommendations about books of this era that may be interesting?
Well, that's very that's a very interesting comment, because I actually found Helen Winlock's archive by reading The Visitors. If you read the acknowledgements in the back, you'll see that Sally Beaumont credits the archivist at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is where I visited and photographed all of Helen Winlock's letters. I think it is pretty true to what was going on in Egypt on site at Metropolitan House at the time, of course, with some authorial license, but Helen's letters are very descriptive about the minutiae of day-to-day living. One of her children was actually born in Cairo, so there's a lot of detail about, you know, her pregnancy and the birth and her recovery afterwards. As to recommendations, I suppose the old nugget are the Amelia Peabody books. I've been asked in the past if I feel that Emma influenced the writing of those books at all. And I certainly see certain character traits in Amelia Peabody that I can trace through Emma's diaries as well. I think they were both quite outspoken and didn't really care what other people thought about them. So if you haven't read those already, I'm sure you have, Elizabeth Peters, then I recommend them.
Yeah. Mary would like to know, is there any mention of contemporary Egyptian women in the diaries?
Not by name. Emma does visit a number of villages, and she visits one particular family and sits with the children, so plays with the children, but the women don't actually come out, and they certainly refuse to have their photographs taken as well. So there aren't any real specifics about the women, unfortunately. The most detail is provided about the sailors that they interact with on the boat and the continued relationship that they have with those over the course of their decades in Egypt.
Okay, let's see. What was Mrs. Davis doing while Theodore and Emma were making all of these trips to Egypt?
Well, it's a great question. She does actually accompany them on one of the trips, and Emma does mention her in the diaries. But she spent a lot of time with her sister, Sarah Buttles, so she lived with her for a period of time, and she did travel with her sister as well. On one of the trips, Theodore and Emma meet up with Annie in Paris, but she kept a very low profile. From what I can tell, with some of the archival research I've been doing, Annie was a very timid character, and Emma and Theodore were not. They had a fairly dysfunctional relationship between the three of them. If Annie would ask Theodore a question, Theodore would not address Annie directly. Emma would ask Theodore Annie's question, Theodore would answer Emma, and then Emma would tell, and they would all be sitting at the same table. So
Wow.
I'm not surprised Annie didn't want to travel with them.
Yes, that's so interesting. In that same vein, Fred would like to know, with all the different characters, can you detect the conflicts and contradictions in the various diary texts?
Yes, there are a number of Sometimes not so much the conflicts and contradictions, but certainly with Emma's diaries, the longest volumes are the first 5 or 6 volumes. But by the time it gets to volumes 16 through 19, they're really very, very short. I mean, she was in her late 70s at that point, and Theodore was suffering from dementia. So they really have very little detail in them. And that's where Helen Winlock and Mary Buttles Newbury come into their own. So they provide a lot more contextual detail. They also, I think, being a younger generation, they tend to speak a little bit more frankly about, they're more willing to gossip, I'll say, whereas Emma is quite formal and more interested in just reporting the details. I hope that answers your question.
All right, another question from DJ. Is there any reference to Minnie Burton, Harry Burton's wife, in your archival material?
Yeah, she's mentioned in the Helen Winlock letters, and of course her diaries are online at the Griffith Institute. But the photograph I showed you of Helen Winlock at the beginning of the presentation, Minnie Burton is also sitting in that photograph as well. So she's mentioned a couple of times by Helen Winlock, but she's not mentioned by Emma Andrews, although they are very close to Harry Burton. They often meet with him in Italy as well as in Egypt. And Harry was very good to Theodore Davis in his latter years. He'd wrap Theodore up in a blanket and take him motoring around the roads of Italy. So they did have a close connection in that regard.
Wow. It's all of these tidbits just make these people, they're so real. It's really fascinating. Another person looking for mentions of names. Was there any mention in the diary of Dr. Hamdi, or excuse me, in the diaries of Dr. Salah Hamdi, who had worked closely with Carter?
Not off the top of my head, but I can take a look for that in the, I'll run my computer script and see if I can spit out a name. So I'm happy to do that. If you want to email RC with your in fact, my email's on this slide as well, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to take a closer look for you.
Okay. And I think we're gonna have time for 2 more questions and then we'll have to close, but for all of our guests, if you have additional questions, we can send them to Dr. Ketchley. And what we have done when we have lots of questions in the past is we'll send an email answering the questions if we're able to all of our attendees today. So we'll have time, just 2 more questions. This is such a fascinating topic. I know everyone is interested. There's a few questions on this topic. So is the lack of photo documentation of Emma conspicuous? And if so, do you think it was intentional?
So I think the short answer to that is yes, I think it was intentional. It's very telling to me that there are no photos. Her diary has vanished, her handwritten diary has vanished. I visited her grave in Columbus, Ohio. She's buried at the Green Lawn Cemetery with her family. They are all buried in kind of the family plot. They're all buried very close together. Emma is buried at a bit of a distance from the family under a tree by herself. So I think there was a certain amount of shame associated with her relationship with Theodore Davis. And I mentioned that the aftermath of Theodore's death was very contentious. His family were very much on Annie's side. And so I think there was a calculated campaign of destruction of pretty much any record of Emma that they could find, rather like in ancient Egypt when, Hatshepsut or Akhenaten would be erased from the record. So they made an attempt to erase Emma from the record as well.
All right, now we'll close with one question that I think is probably lots of people would like to know. Can we access any of these diaries online? And go ahead.
Yes, so we are about a month away from releasing everything that we have been working on. We started with the website emmabandrews.org, but it soon became apparent that I was dealing with a lot more material than just Emma Andrews's diaries. So we own the domain travelersinegypt.com. So we have been steadily shifting all of our material there, including our biographical databases, our immersive reader, our images, etc. So I have students working to finish that up, and then we will make an announcement on our Instagram page, which is the Emma B. Andrews Diary Project, when it's ready to go. And then, yes, the diaries will all be available for reading. And we would value any feedback as well that you have, any improvements that we can make to either the content or to the user experience as well.
Well, that's truly exciting that we'll all, I'm sure everyone that's on here today will be keeping an eye on the Instagram page and getting ready to read these diaries. So we will, to all of our guests who are on here today, when that does come online, we'll make sure that we link that through some of our RC website and our Instagram as well, so that we can help magnify that message. So I want to thank again Dr. Ketchley for being here today. This was truly a fascinating talk to have a window into these lives in this time. Thank you to all of our attendees for being here today. Please make sure that you keep an eye on our website, rc.org, for upcoming virtual lectures, information. And if you do have additional questions, I know we couldn't get to all of them today. If you send them to info@rc.org, the email address, again, that's info@rc.org, we'll do our best to get those answered for you. So with that, I'd like to thank again Dr. Ketchley and all of our guests for being here today. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.